chapter 6, section 1. We are going to begin this section by talking about the land of Canaan. It's at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. Today, it is the land that is shared by Israel and Lebanon. Back in ancient times, it was kind of a land bridge. If you were going between Egypt and Mesopotamia, you went through the land of Canaan. Soldiers, shepherds, merchants, they all pass through there, and they carry ideas with them and physical items with them. And you're going to have two groups that are going to settle here. You're going to have the Hebrews, and you're going to have the Phoenicians. Both will establish kingdoms based on trade and learning. So let's begin by talking about the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are going to live in the northern kingdom. And what we know about the Phoenicians comes from a variety of different sources. Some of it comes from the Bible. Some of it comes from writings of other people. We found ruins of their cities, of ships. And so the Phoenicians are actually part of a larger group. The larger group were the Canaanites. The Canaanites came from the desert south and to the east into the land of Canaan. And these were herders, and they wandered from pasture to pasture. Philistines live in the southern part of Canaan along the coast. They came from near Greece. They were traders. They were shipbuilders. Okay, so you have the Phoenicians that are living kind of in the northern part up there, and you have the Philistines living in the southern part, and this is all in Canaan here. So by 1200 BC, the Phoenicians have built cities and towns in Canaan here. It's just they built them along this narrow strip of land between the land and the sea. The land was very fertile, but it wasn't enough land to grow very much food, and so they turned to the sea to make a living. Now, the mountains near Phoenicia were covered in cedar forests. And so they used the wood from all of these cedar trees to make ships. The ships were strong. The ships were fast. And they began as coastal traders. But eventually, they became very widely traveled. They controlled the trade of really the entire Mediterranean after a while. And they would trade cedar, they would trade cloth, they would trade glass, they would trade perfume. And in return, they would receive gold and other metals. Their ships really became traveling workshops, and the sailors themselves were artisans as they learned to work with all of this material. The sailors are going to plot their course by using the stars and the sun, and they're going to visit many unexplored areas. They possibly went all around Africa, even possibly to India. It's also even thought that the Phoenicians might have went to America about 2,000 years before Columbus did. And in all of this traveling that they did, they learned to make agreements or make treaties. These agreements between states or countries. And the Phoenicians used this to keep peace. They might give, if you give us free shipments of goods, we'll guarantee your independence or something like that. They would have these different agreements, these treaties, with other places. But the thing is, Phoenicia never united. The cities of Phoenicia, they were separated by mountains. And actually, Phoenicia really was just a collection of independent city states. You had Tyre, which was the largest. You have Byblos, you have Beirut, you have Sidon. You know, the cities all spoke the same language, and the cities practiced the same religion, which is why they're referred to together as Phoenicians. But they didn't always get along necessarily. They were always looking for more profit, which led to jealousy, which led to fighting and quarrels. Um, the people referred to them by their city state name. They didn't refer to themselves as Phoenicians. The very first cities were ruled by kings or the high priest. But later on, rich merchants made the king share power. The merchants would create the council of merchants, and the king had to share power with them. And eventually you get to the point where the council was telling the king what to do. Most of these cities would have stone walls for protection. They would have shops that would sell wooden items, metal items. They learned metalworking from the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. Because remember, we talked about how the Egyptians and Mesopotamians traveled back and forth. They had to go through their land. The cities that they made, they were crowded. The streets were narrow. The buildings were close. And usually the ports were outside of the walls. And the ports were centers of activity. You had goods being loaded and unloaded. You had records being kept and goods being stored in warehouses. And these city-states of the Phoenicians, these were cloth dyeing centers. The Phoenicians made this very expensive purple dye that was greatly demanded. Phoenician actually means of purple merchants. And according to the legend, a god, Melqart, was walking his girlfriend, Tyrus, and a dog along the coast. And the dog picks up a shellfish, which we call the murex. And when the dog bites into this shellfish, the dog's mouth turns purple. Tyrus, the girlfriend, likes the color and demands a gown in that color. And so Melqart gets a gown and dyes it this purple color. And so they became this center of purple, this very sought after purple dye. As far as religion goes, they were polytheistic. Their gods were tied to nature. They thought the gods met people on the hills and under the trees. And so at first they worshipped people or worshipped gods in these places that the people would meet the gods, on the hills and the trees. But as time went on, they built temples. And the temples would have an entrance hall, and they would have a main hall. And you can see there in the picture, you have this entrance hall, then you have the main hall, and then to the very right there, you had something called the Holy of Holies. This was the most sacred chamber. This is where the image or sacred stone, whatever it is that symbolized the God they were worshiping, was kept. And inside of here, there would be a stone altar where they would sacrifice wine or perfume or animals, or could be even humans. The priests would offer the sacrifices. It kept the gods strong and friendly. After death, they would bury the dead in clay urns in the beginning, these ornamental vases. But as time went on, they would embalm the bodies, of course, being influenced by the Egyptians. And they would place these embalmed bodies in stone coffins in hillsides and cemeteries. Let's talk about the city-state of Carthage. Okay, in because the Phoenicians, again, they went all over the Mediterranean, and they set up trading posts along the coast of North Africa. And some even built colonies in North Africa, these permanent settlements that turned into cities. So Carthage was one of those, founded in 814 BC. The legend goes it was founded by the Princess Dido. She originally ruled Tyre. Her brother was jealous and killed her husband. She was afraid she was next, so she fled to North Africa and founded Carthage. Carthage is going to become a Mediterranean power, a great trading city. There's even thoughts that the Carthaginians may have gone to the British Isles even for tin. And you'll hear about the power of Carthage later on when we start getting into the Roman time periods. The ideas that the Phoenicians had are going to spread all over with all of their trading, but probably the most important gift that they are going to give the world was the alphabet. They didn't invent the alphabet, they spread the alphabet. The Phoenicians themselves at first used picture writing. Problem is, to keep track of trading records, picture writing is too hard. And so they borrow a simple version of hieroglyphics from other Canaan towns that had 22 symbols or letters. And they carried it to Europe. The Greeks are going to borrow it. The Romans will borrow it from the Greeks. And most Western alphabets today are based on the Romans, including English. So you can get the beginnings of our alphabet back to the time of the Phoenicians.